In this ThinkScript tutorial, we'll be building our very own relative performance indicator. Now the goal of this indicator is to help us benchmark stocks to be able to very easily find outperformers. Now let me show you some examples so you know what we're looking to build. Here's an example of comparing a stock using the indicator against the benchmark of the index markets. For example, here I have Tesla against the QQQ ETF, and this is going back 30 bars from where price is currently trading, and over those 30 bars, Tesla has outperformed the NASDAQ ETF. Tesla has returned in terms of where prices closed both days, 33.66%. Meanwhile, the QQQ ETF is at 17.88%. If we change the benchmark to the S&P 500 instead, we change the stock to Procter & Gamble, we can see Procter & Gamble in the same time period has underperformed when compared to the S&P 500. So that's one example of comparing a stock against an index market. Now another example might be comparing a holding against the parent sector. So here's two examples of stocks inside of the same sector, XLK, but you can very easily see the stock that's outperforming the sector, which is Apple, compared to the stock that's underperforming the sector, which is Microsoft. That makes it very easy to do using these labels, which clearly tell you not only the percentages, but also in one quick word, if it's underperforming or outperforming. And finally, a third example, which really zooms out, gives you the ability to choose any two markets you'd like. So for example, here I'm looking at Lowe's compared to Home Depot. There we can see Lowe's is outperforming by just a tad, but still Lowe's is winning. And another example here, if you were looking to compare, say, gold to Bitcoin, using the two ETFs there, we can see gold is underperforming, and gold is underperforming pretty dramatically over the same 30-bar look-back period when you compare it to something like Bitcoin. So this one indicator makes it very easy to compare two different markets against one another to try and find outperformers, also find underperformers, and use that information to try and craft your trades. Now in terms of the specific indicator we'll be building, here's some features we're going to add inside of this to make it a little bit easier for the user to use. The first is, we'll give two different choices for what the benchmark type is going to be. A user can select either a specific date, in which case they specify a date here, and this is the date used to try and see the look back period for the close value. Or you can use the past X bars, which is what I used in the previous example, with the default value of 30, but let's say you wanted to increase that to 90 bars, you could very easily change that value here. So that's the first feature. The user can change the benchmark type and then specify the value for each type. The second feature is the user can also change the symbol that they'd like to benchmark to directly from the studies menu. So you don't need to go inside of the code to change what symbol you'd like to compare against. If say instead of SPY you want to change this to QQQ, you just type that in here. Or if you want some other market altogether, maybe even a futures market or even a Forex market, simply type that in here and that's the value that's used. And then finally, you have the choice between detailed and simple labels. So for those of you that have charts with a lot of labels already on them, you might prefer the simple labels, which simply tells you underperform or outperform with the color coordination to make things easier. Now for Volatility Box members, I've taken this tutorial one step further, and I'll show you how to take the same code we've written, change it up just a little bit, and use that to turn ThinkOrSwim into your very own database. You can see things like what the actual percentage values are for a large group of stocks, how that's different compared to the S&P 500, what is outperforming and by how much, compared to, say, what is underperforming and by how much. Do this simple trick, hopefully that gets your gears rolling in terms of understanding ways to unleash the power of ThinkOrSwim, specifically the scan tab, and turn that into your own database. In this case, we'll use this performance metric as our metric that we're looking to query for, but you'll learn tips and tricks to be able to run whatever queries you'd like. Now, the downloads for this tutorial are available in the description box below. Again, as part of this tutorial, we'll be building the relative outperformance indicator, which allows you to really measure the performance against any symbol. The catch here is the limit is one symbol, so we have whatever's on our chart being benchmarked against one other symbol. We'll also make the labels a little bit smarter, and that's what we'll be building in this particular video. The download link for those that would like to either skip the tutorial or download the code to follow along, that's in the description box below, and you can download that and import into your platform. Now for Volatility Box members, I've taken this one step further, and we have part 2 of this tutorial coming out, in which I'll show you how to turn this code into something that lets you really query ThinkOrSwim as a database. We can scan for outperforming stocks, we can compare the percentages for a much larger list. Instead of a limit of 1, we have a limit of 2,000 stocks here, so much greater in terms of how many different things you can compare. And you can then start to do things like layer on your own custom studies to filter down these stocks to the ones that you care about. This tutorial is included for free for all Volatility Box members, and you can find a link for it directly on our Learn page along with the description box below. Alright, with that out of the way, let's now dive into the actual ThinkScript tutorial piece. Now inside of your ThinkOrSwim platform, click the Studies icon, and then click Create to start writing your own indicator. Now let's give this a name first. I'll call this TI_relative performance. And we can delete the code that's already inside and start writing our own code. Now let's start first with our input variables, and we can set the input variables for the benchmark type first and set all of the logic associated with bars versus date. So let's say input benchmark type, and here we gave the user 2 different choices. They could either use a set number of bars going back, or choose a specific date and use the close of that date. Now with each one of these choices comes in the choice for the user to select particular look back periods. So say the user selects bars, then we can create a look back period value, which would be 30 bars, and connect these two later on in the code. And say the user selects date, then the user can input a date here themselves. I'll set in a default placeholder value here, but this is where the user can change the date, and that would then again change stuff inside of the logic. Now the last thing the user can also select here is the actual symbol. So there I can say benchmark, and we'll set that equal to SPY as our default value. Now let's use these 4 input variables first to start creating the logic associated with making this line right here work, where if the user does change between bars or date, things actually change inside of the code. Now there's really 2 values that are going to get affected based on what the user selects here, and that's going to be each of the close prices for both the current symbol along with the benchmark symbol. The current symbol is the chart that the user is on, so in this case Tesla, and the benchmark symbol is the one we specify inside of the code. So let's define each one of those here. So I'll say benchmark, and we'll say previous close to refer to the historical close value, which is going to be our first data point for comparison. And in the same way, I'll use something for the current stock price. I'll say cur previous close. Now each one of these is just tying to the previous close value, but it's not really being defined anywhere. There's no value assigned to it. So let's go ahead and fix that by using something called a switch variable. Here I'll say switch, set that switch equal to our benchmark type, and open the switch up with a curly bracket, and then I'll close it out as well just so we don't forget to do that. Now inside of this, we have 2 different cases for our switch. The first case is option number 1, which was bars, and the second case is option number 2, which was date. Now let's go ahead and define what benchmark previous close would be if the user selected bars. So if the user selected bars here, then our benchmark close would be close. The symbol would be equal to benchmark. That's for this benchmark ticker right here. Once we get the close value of that particular market, we can close that out, and we look back, the look back period, to understand the exact close price that was true 30 bars ago. Now if the user selects, say, date instead, that logic changes just a little bit. For date here, we have benchmark previous close, but our first test needs to be, is this the date that we specified? So for that, let's use the get YYYMMDD function. This is built inside of ThinkOrSwim, and we're checking, is that equal to the date? If that is, then record the closing price, again for the benchmark, and if that's not the date, then simply carry whatever value we have saved forward, since we know that that's the value as of that previous date. Now you'll notice the only error that we have left is for the current pre-close value. So let's go ahead and define that next using a very similar approach here. I'll say current previous close is simply equal to the close going back, the look back period. Same idea here, except we don't need to specify the symbol. And then you probably have guessed it, but our idea for the date is the same as well, except we don't need to specify the symbol either. So we can say if we're equal to the date, then simply return the close value from that particular date. And if not, then carry forward this previous close value. So now what we should have here is a variable that's tracking the benchmark previous close versus the current previous close, and that's changing based off of whatever the user selects. So let's go ahead and test that out first. I'll say add label here. Let's go ahead and set this label to always plot true since we're using it for testing. And there we can set this equal to benchmark previous close, or actually let's set it equal to current previous close. And then let's set this equal to a value of yellow. Now if I click OK, apply, we should see a label plot, and that's telling us what the close value should be, 30 bars from the previous bar, and this is set to bar, so we know it's 30 bars. That value should be 673.42. So let's go ahead and see if that's true. We count 30 bars from the candle prior to the current bar. So 30 bars would be this candle right here. And the close value for this candle, 673.42. You can see that up here. Let me go over that one more time. 673.42, and that matches the label that we have. So we know the bars is functioning the way we expect it to. Now let's go ahead and change it to the date. The default date that we had set this to was February 2nd, 2017. So I'll click date, apply, and that value should change from 673.42 right up here. Let's go ahead and see if it does. Okay, we now have 876.35. Let's go back to February 2nd, 2022, or February 17, excuse me. That's this candle right here. And if we look at the close there, 876.35, same place where we had it before. One more time, Feb 17th, 876.35. So that should give you an idea now that we've defined the benchmark close and the current previous close values correctly, and these are tied to both the look back period along with the date. So the first 3 lines of our input variables are now being used inside of our code. Now the next thing we need to go ahead and define is the actual performance value. And that's going to be what is the difference between the current close along with our previous close to get the result in some sort of a rankable metric. So for that, let's go ahead and create 2 new variables here. We'll say def benchmark performance, and we can first measure the performance of our benchmark symbol. Now the formula that I'm going to be using here is taking our current close price, subtract it from whatever our previous close price is. So I'll say current divided by or minus previous, and then we're going to divide it by the same previous price to get the difference in terms of a percentage value. So that's the formula I'm looking to translate here inside of the code for both the benchmark performance along with the current stock charts performance as well for the same period. So let's start with the benchmark performance here first. We can say benchmark close, so that's the current close value of the benchmark, minus benchmark previous close. This is going to be our numerator, and then we divide this by benchmark previous close. We're getting an error here that we don't have the benchmark close value defined yet, so let's go ahead and do so. I can do that towards the top of our code here, so I'll say def benchmark close. That's going to be equal to simply the close, and the symbol is equal to benchmark. Okay, so now this line is compiling, which is giving us the benchmark's performance as a percentage. Let's go ahead and test that out. So I'll plug that in here into the same label, and this is now looking at the S&P 500, tracking the percentage difference from, I think it's set to still date, so it'll be setting it from a date, and that's a negative 2.28% from February 17th, 2022. Let's go ahead and test that. So if I test this to switch that, I go to a symbol of SPY. That number should not change. Okay, perfect. So it still hasn't changed. Now we find February 17th, which is this candle right here. The close value of that candle compared to the close value of the current candle, should be right around negative 2.25 to 2.28%. You might have a little bit different numbers there based off of rounding and zooming in to get the exact close price, but we know that this label is working the way we expect it to. Now we can make this label look a little bit nicer. And we can also plot out, instead of just the benchmark performance, the current stock chart's performance as well. So we know the benchmark is working. Let's create one more variable here for our current stock price. So we'll say cur performance, and this is going to be, instead of benchmark close, just our current close price minus our cur previous close. We take that same value, and that's going to be used for our division. Now let's go ahead and output each one of these. So I'll first start by saying yes, and here let's say first plotting out our current chart's performance, and we'll use the as % function here and feed in this cur performance variable through there. And then let's go ahead and add in a divider here so it looks a little cleaner, plus, and then now we need to add in our benchmark symbol, and that's going to be dynamic, so I'll use the actual variable here. And then I need to add in one quote, so we can add in the semicolon, space, and then we can add now our benchmark performance as well, and set that inside of an as % value. Now, one other thing we can do before we click save and test this is make our colors a little bit more dynamic. So we can say if our cur performance is greater than our benchmark performance, then color.green, else color. Let's make it yellow instead of red. Okay, click apply. And now what we're seeing is a comparison of the current stock chart to, in this case, SPY. Now here we're seeing the same value since we are on a chart of the S&P 500. Let's change this to, say, Apple. Now Apple here, we can see Apple over that same date range that we're looking at. Apple has performed positive plus 1.91% as the return, compared to the S&P 500, which is a minus 2.28%. If I change this from date to bars, so 30 bars instead of using the date, click apply, we can see that the numbers are now adjusting for the past 30 bars, so a little bit more recent price activity compared to going back to February. And if instead of, say, SPY here, we change this to be the sector, I can simply type in XLK, click OK, click apply, and you'll see the numbers now adjust along with the label, where we now have the current performance, and then we have XLK now instead of SPY, along with what the historical performance has been over the same look back period for XLK, 18.48%. So now that we have that, let's create one more set of labels here, which are the simple labels. So we'll say add labels, and there we can say yes here to plotting this label, and we'll simply say if our, and actually we can use the color code logic here to make this even easier. So we'll say delete everything we have inside of this. If our current performance is greater than our benchmark performance, then plot out the word outperform, else plot out the word underperform. And then let's create one more input variable here, which is detailed labels, and we can set that equal to yes as a default value. And if we plug that into the second set of labels we have, we can now turn those on and off. So if I click apply, okay, let's go ahead and give this a little test run. So we're comparing Apple to XLK. Now let's compare Microsoft to XLK, which should be underperform. If I come in here, we load in XLK. Let's check out NVIDIA and Visa and MasterCard next. NVIDIA outperform, Visa underperform, MasterCard underperform. So very quickly here, you're able to cycle through and get an idea of which stocks are underperforming, which stocks are overperforming, and you can see the exact percentage values as well. Again, for Volatility Box members, keep in mind we're going to take this one step further and create something where inside of our scan tab, you can feed in a custom watch list or actually run a scan and get an idea of what that performance is directly here, so that you can use ThinkOrSwim as more of a database where you can see a large list of stocks instead of just individual stocks that you need to cycle through and individually compare against. Alright, so hopefully you found this tutorial to be useful in building our very own relative performance indicator. One quick recap of everything we built inside of this tutorial. We started with defining all of our input variables. We then defined the logic to create a switch variable, which allowed us to really connect the user changing bars versus date to then using either one of these values and tracking the appropriate close for those values. Once we had that, the rest was a breeze. We were able to calculate performance here, and we were able to then plug those values into labels using some fairly simple conditional logic to make the labels a little bit smarter. One cool thing that I'll add that we did just to call out is using the symbol output here, the text output, as the actual variable here, which then makes this label a little bit more dynamic and allows you to see whatever you're trying to benchmark against and how that has performed against your current symbol. You can find the download link for the final version of the indicator in the description box below, and for all Volatility Box members, you can also find the link for part 2, which is going to be released soon, inside of the description box as well, which walks through how to unlock this code to really turn ThinkOrSwim into your own database of sorts, where you can scan for outperforming stocks, compare percentages for a much larger list of stocks, 2,000 instead of just the one, and you can then even do things like filter on through your own custom studies to narrow down the list of stocks you might be interested in. Alright, take care everyone, good luck trading, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.